From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there, and welcome to Chicago Newsroom here on Can TV. I'm Ken Davis. You know, we've been saying for a long time that the election in 2016 is very, very far away, but we're at a kind of a milestone here, aren't we? Almost to the day, it's about a year away from the 2016 election. And we've really kind of lost interest, I think, in the presidential campaign, because if you look at the polling today, you know that Marco Rubio is almost certainly going to become our next president. There will be a vast Republican majority in the House and the Senate, so he'll replace 3 or 4 Supreme Court justices, and in his 8 years, he will remake America in a much better and crisper image. So let's forget about that and talk about some local races that we think are really going to be important. And I would argue that there is none in 2016 that's more important than the state's attorney's office. Anita Alvarez has been in that office for 8 years, and she's being challenged rather vigorously this time around. And we're very happy to have Kim Foxx joining us at the table today. Kim Foxx is one of those individuals who wants Anita Alvarez's job. So thank you for being here. Thanks for being with us. It's interesting that you want Anita Alvarez's job because you used to work for her. You worked in that office.
I did. I was an assistant state's attorney for 12 years. In the last 5 of those years, I was a supervisor in the juvenile delinquency division, and I worked for Anita Alvarez for 4 of those years. So yes, I've had an insider's view of the office, and I know how much better the office could be with the right leadership.
So something happened, maybe slowly, maybe less slowly, where you kind of looked around and said, you know, I don't know, I just think I could do a better job. I think I could run this place better. Why? What happened?
I don't know if it's something that happened. I think if you look at our criminal justice system as a whole, I think there are gaps in the way that we treat communities, that criminal justice is not just about the individual incident and the individual defendant or victim. It's about what happens when the case is over and that victim goes back into the community. Do they trust their surroundings anymore? Do they feel like they've had their time to be heard? And for the defendant, you know, what's going to happen with their sentence and what happens when they come back? And I feel like the office had very much been isolated into this one moment in time, and we hadn't looked at the ripple effects of what happens with our criminal justice system. And during my time in the state's attorney's office, I was very much consumed by that. What happens to the communities in which the victims live and the defendants live, and what happens in the wake of our justice system. And I think in my time in the state's attorney's office and under this current state's attorney, what I realized is that when you look at the bigger picture, we weren't necessarily being very thoughtful or strategic about the bigger picture. And what happens when you don't do that is you keep chasing individual cases, but you're not really stopping new crimes from happening because you're not thinking broadly enough of, if we take care of these issues here, perhaps that'll stop these issues from percolating in the beginning.
This is really interesting to me because I'm not sure that I understand the degree to which that is the state's attorney's job. I mean, I guess we've all kind of grown up to believe that the state's attorney is just there to sort of charge the bad guys and try to get them out of our society as much as they can. You're looking at it in a more broad sense, I take it.
I'd say holistically, right? I mean, I think the state's attorney's charge is around public safety, to make sure that our communities are safe and that the quality of life is equal for people no matter what neighborhood that you live in. And so part of that means that, yes, if a crime is committed, that you hold people accountable for the crimes that they've committed, that you do your best to make victims feel whole. It's not just let's lock up the bad guys, because the solutions are varied. I mean, the solutions may be someone needs to go to jail for a really long period of time. For others, it may mean, you know what, you've got some mental health challenges that aren't really the criminal issues, but mental health issues. And even though the law says that you've done something that you shouldn't have done, am I gonna make the situation better or worse with the sentence that I impose? So when you say, I'm gonna just throw you in jail and not deal with the issues that got you there, if you have a mental health issue or a drug addiction issue, I'm just going to house you somewhere and then let you out, there's a strong probability that I'm going to see you again because we've not dealt with the issues that got you there in the first place.
But doesn't that put you kind of at odds with what is a generally broad sense of thinking right now, led by Superintendent McCarthy and Mayor Emanuel, that the problem we're having in our streets with all of this horrific violence that we're living with every day is that we just don't have strong enough gun laws, that we need to have stricter gun laws, we need to have mandatory minimums, we need to get the judges and perhaps even the prosecutors out of the process here. Once you're caught, you need to go away for a good long time. It's kind of the opposite thinking, isn't it?
I don't know if it's opposite or if I'm realizing that the issues are much broader than that. That is not a silver bullet, right? We need to deal with the gun epidemic in Chicago. That is real. It is taking lives every day. And the frustration that the mayor has, the police superintendent has, is that no one wants to see 9-year-olds murdered near their grandmother's house. But to suggest that the issues around violence are solely related to guns without dealing with the issues of concentrated poverty, without dealing with the issues of high unemployment, without looking at the divestment in the neighborhoods where the violence is at its highest, is to suggest that once we lock up all the people who have guns, that all of a sudden we will have thriving communities that don't have other issues. Mm-hmm. I think they go hand in hand, and we should be thoughtful and strategic about dealing with gun violence, but we should also deal with these issues at the same time. We've gotten to the belief that we can't walk and chew gum at the same time, that we can't deal with gun violence and deal with unemployment, education, and poverty at the same time. If you don't do that, we're just going to be chasing the next criminal justice issue.
But I'm sorry to push back on this again, but I'm not sure that I understand how that's the role of the state's attorney. I mean, if the police department comes to you with somebody who they've nailed, who was, had a loaded gun and it was not legal and blah, 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 you're not going to look at that person and say, well, tell me your story about poverty and maybe we'll give you a lesser charge or something, right?
No, absolutely not. You're absolutely right. We're going to deal with those issues as they come. The problem that we don't talk about is that we have a lot of young people with guns. So we're talking about 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds who have guns. The question that we should always be asking, even when we take that gun and we try to figure out what the punishment is why do we have 13, 14, and 15-year-olds with guns? Who's giving them the guns, and are we being strategic about how do we stop the flow of guns, that we can deal with the possessors, but we also need to deal with the people who are trafficking guns, either they're straw purchasers or folks who are going across borders and buying tons of guns. We need to be thoughtful about that, but we also need to understand that there is something wrong with community when we have 13-year-olds possessing guns and using them. That when we look at the mortality rates for these communities and we realize that the number of young men who are under the age of 25 that are being murdered, that it's not just that issue. So it's not a matter of having a session with the person who has the gun. We have to deal with all of it together and hold people accountable for their actions. But you can't ignore the other pieces to the puzzle.
It ties in, as you've said, everything ties into everything, and that's one of the themes of our show. We talk about this all the time, but there have been a lot of discussions about who the populations are in our jails and in our prisons. And the situation of Cook County Jail is very different from the prison system, the federal prisons. But there are similarities, and one of those similarities is that they are disproportionately populated by minorities. And I'm not sure that I understand that there is any way to actually deal forcefully with that issue. But I'm really curious about how you think. Let's take prison population first of all. The prison population is, as we all know, overwhelmingly black in Illinois and probably federally too. How did that happen, and is there a solution to that?
Yeah, so I think, like you said, we can all agree that disproportionality is real, that it's not anecdotal, it's not if you walk around and look, you can see. We have data for decades that it's not just a Cook County or state of Illinois issue, it is a United States issue. The president has been talking about the disproportionality issues for the last several weeks as criminal justice reform has been part of his agenda in his waning days. I think part of it is, how we police neighborhoods and where we focus our attention in our law enforcement efforts. So, for example, if we talk on the federal level, there were 2 separate sentencing guidelines for cocaine. There was a powder cocaine and there was crack cocaine. And those laws came up in the height of the crack cocaine era of the 80s, where violence, we talk about the violence today, but the violence in the 80s was about twice as high in Chicago as it is now. The murder rate, we were hovering around 800, 900 people a year.
That does seem hard to remember, but it's true.
It's true. And so part of it was, well, how do we deal with that? Well, we know that a lot of that was being driven by drug dealing and crack cocaine because it was new and it was the hot commodity, and that it was breeding, some of this violence. And so the reactionary thought was, well, we will enhance the penalties for possessing crack cocaine because we know where crack cocaine is largely used and it is tied into the violence. We're not doing it for powder cocaine, which, was a more expensive drug, was not easily as disseminated through those communities. And we enhanced the crack so high that it was targeted towards poor communities, largely minority communities.
As opposed to the powder, which
as opposed
was not.
to the powder, which was not. So you had laws that on their face were looking to protect public safety and to deal with the epidemic of crack, ignoring the fact that people who were addicted to crack weren't criminals, they were drug addicts. And so when you have laws that are targeting communities, that's what you get. So you've seen 30 years since the epidemic began and since those sentencing policies came into place, and they were largely targeted at African Americans, and that's what you get.
So then, are you saying that as state's attorney, if you became our next state's attorney, that you would take a more proactive public role in attempting to get laws changed or modified? I mean, would you be an advocate out there for something like that?
Absolutely, and across the board.
Do you think that's the role of a
I absolutely think that's the role. I come back to the notion that the state's attorney's job is to ensure public safety, and that when you want to ensure public safety, one of the core things that you do is make sure that neighborhoods are stabilized. And so if we are having policies that are destabilizing neighborhoods because we're sending people away for low-level offenses and they get out and they can't get a job and they're fed back into a neighborhood where unemployment is already high and we expect them to contribute, that's a problem. And we know that one of the best factors to preventing recidivism is a job. And so I don't want that person who comes out of our criminal justice system to return, especially at the expense of another victim, or at the expense of the quality of life for the people who live in that neighborhood. So I have to be an advocate for that. If mental health services are being cut at the state level, and we have a population of people who aren't able to get treatment, and they're standing outside the Walgreens, or they're standing outside your favorite restaurant, and they're harassing you, and they have no place to put them, you're frustrated, they bring them to our jail. I'm not equipped to deal with that in a jail. We're doing the best that we can. I need to be in Springfield telling the legislature, listen, when you cut mental health services, when we don't have a place for them to go, they come to our jails. That's real. And as your chief law enforcement officer, I have to be thoughtful about that. Going to Springfield just for penalty enhancements is not thoughtful law enforcement. Going to Springfield and saying, when you cut school resources, when we don't have social workers in the classroom, and we have students with behavioral or educational issues acting out in manners and not the right people equipped to deal with them in the schoolhouse, they're coming to the jailhouse. No one wants to see that. But if you don't have the law enforcement leading that charge, we're not going to see the difference that we need.
So I'd like to have you clarify for me,
Sure.
as the state's attorney, would you disagree with the mayor and the police superintendent about the need for more strict gun laws? Would you oppose that? Do you think we need mandatory minimums?
So my issue with mandatory minimums is, again, to what I was just talking about around crack cocaine. The drug laws of the 80s were predicated on mandatory minimums, and that if we have these strict laws and people won't use these drugs, and we'll send a message, and we've seen where that's gotten us. We have laws on the books right now in which judges have the ability to set sentences. The issue is around accountability. What are the sentences that they're setting? I mean, the frustration I think that the mayor and the governor or the superintendent have is they believe that people are out less than a year. The question that I have to ask is, why is that? Is it because the cases are taking so long to come through our court system, that by the time that the case is gone to trial, that they've already done time served, or that they've, if it's day to day, the case is pretty much over by the time we've gotten to trial.
I see, yeah.
We need to look at all the factors. So if it's slow case processing times, let's deal with that. If it's that judges, are varying across the board in wide, arrays in terms of how they do sentences, what's the accountability for that? Who's accountable for the sentences that are being handed out? I think we have strong laws right now. The question is, we don't have any clarity of how they're being imposed. And the de facto belief that if you just take discretion away from them, then we'll know what the consequences are, I think is short-sighted.
I have to say that I've always been a little bit leery of the idea that the solution to our problem is to take the discretion away from judges. I mean, that's what judges are supposed to do, is judge, right? And
then when you take it from the judges, by having these mandatory minimums, you give it to the prosecutor.
Yeah.
It's the prosecutor who decides what charges to bring.
Right.
And so
very important point.
It's extremely important, because when you're dealing with these issues and you're talking about removing the discretion, the ultimate discretion holder in these cases is the prosecutor, because the prosecutor has the ability to make charges. They charge high, they charge low, they don't charge at all. And so all of the discretion is housed with the prosecutor when you remove it from the judges.
That raises another interesting question about the conversation that's been going on for years about trying to get non-violent offenders out of the system, or at least not have them be victimized by the system as much. That there have been arguments that there are, many, many high percentages of the incarcerated are people who are in there for very non-violent offenses, a few ounces of cocaine or something. Now, of course, that has become very controversial. Not too long ago at the City Club of Chicago, Anita Alvarez just took that on directly and said it's not true, that in Cook County Jail and in the prisons, the people may have gone in this time for a minor offense, but actually they've got a rap sheet and they've got violent offenses in the past. Yeah. That put her at odds with another of your old bosses, Cook County President Tony Preckwinkle, who clearly says, no, that's not true. Now, I have no knowledge of what is true, but I mean, is it possible that we could reduce the jail prison and jail populations by releasing some of these nonviolent offenders?
I don't know if it's about a matter of releasing them or making sure that we're not housing people there in the first place for some of these offenses. So I think both of them are right? So I think the president will say that 70% of folks who are in our jails for nonviolent offenses are talking about their current offense. And I think the state's attorney would say, but yes, if you look at their background, they have a violent offense in their background. The issue becomes, we know that some people, for example, who have mental health issues may have a violent arrest or charge from 15 years ago or from 10 years ago. So yes, if you look at their rap sheet, because of the conditions that they are dealing with, you may see that. Is the jail the place to deal with them for this current offense? Again, it goes back to our broken systems, that these long rap sheets that they have before, what have we done to intervene to get them into the proper venue so that we don't see them? And so I think it's a mix of both. I think we have to be more strategic around, again, low-level drug offenders. If someone has an addiction issue, we have to be more thoughtful of putting them in the right venue to deal with their addiction issue. If someone has a mental health issue, they need to be in the right venue. If you are a predator, we have the right venue for you at 26 in California. That's what we should be doing. And I think the issue becomes, we have so many people who've been tangled in our system that it becomes an all or nothing proposition. they did something in the past, they're bad for the rest of their lives.
Well, Sheriff Dart, of course, who runs the Cook County Jail, says he's running the largest mental institution probably in the United States, and that's probably statistically defendable. Ta-Nehisi Coates in The Atlantic most recently wrote this, and I just wanted to read it to you.
Sure.
The changes needed to achieve an incarceration rate in line with the rest of the developed world are staggering. The popular notion that this can largely be accomplished by releasing nonviolent drug offenders is false. As of 2012, 54% of all inmates in state prisons had been sentenced for violent offenses. One 2004 study found that the proportion of unambiguously low-level drug offenders could be less than 6% in federal and state prisons. So it's much more complicated than just that we're throwing a lot of innocent people in prison.
Yeah, and to be clear, I'm not saying innocent people. I mean, the people who are being charged.
I shouldn't have said innocent either. I didn't mean innocent.
But the people who are being charged, the question is, are we using our criminal justice system to deal with issues around criminal behavior? When you look at our statute books, one of the things I tell people that as a prosecutor in juvenile, it's a felony offense for two students to fight on the school grounds. It's an aggravated battery in a public way. That is a felony offense. The question becomes, and so if you look at the label of that, that's a violent offense. Two kids fighting on the school ground is labeled as a violent offense. So the question is, it's not just about the sentencing, it's opening the books and saying, is this criminal behavior? Is this nuisance behavior? Is this behavior that can best be dealt with elsewhere? And so I'm not, I don't refute the data that he suggests, and I also don't want to oversimplify that it's just the issue of low-level drug offenders. We have issues around prostitution. We have a lot of women who end up in our criminal justice system who've been victimized in their own lives, who also have drug issues. But
because prostitutes are victims too.
They are, but we arrest them, and we've charged them. And if you look at their record, prostitution is not a one and done. You're likely to have multiple arrests. But the issue becomes, should we be treating prostitutes like criminals, or should we be dealing with the issues that they're dealing with? And we're not charging, Johns like we're charging prostitutes. So the question is not simply, it's just low-level drug offenders that will alleviate this. It's a wholesale look at what we're doing across the board at offenses and addressing it that way.
You mentioned Toni Preckwinkle a while ago. You were her chief of staff, so you've had an amazing career. I think it's not hard to find interviews with you in the past where you've talked about your upbringing, that you were born in Cabrini Green and raised over there until you were about 7 years old. And if you don't mind, I'll just stipulate that you had a tough childhood, and you managed to get to law school and become an attorney, and then go to work for not only the state's attorney's office, but in working your way all the way up to Toni Preckwinkle's chief of staff. It's quite an accomplishment, and it can be read about other places, so we'll be jealous of our time now. But one of the things that is said of you is that you're Preckwinkle's girl, that you girl is a pejorative term, you're Preckwinkle's woman. You came up through the Preckwinkle machine, and she wants you to be her state's attorney because she doesn't get along all that well with Alvarez.
Yeah, I've heard that.
I thought you might have.
I've heard that once or twice. Listen, people find it very hard to believe that I did not know President Preckwinkle before I came to work for her. I didn't. She had
at all? I mean,
not at all.
She just recruited you?
So she didn't recruit me. She was working on these issues around criminal justice reform, around the jail. The county spends $500 million every year in our criminal justice system. She had been frustrated by the jail's capacity being 10,500, and she'd assembled teams of people to deal with that, the capacity issues, and are we sending the right people? I was at the state's attorney's office very frustrated because, again, I thought we were very myopic in how we were looking at criminal justice. I'd seen the president give a speech, and I thought I'd like to help her with that because I have the prosecutor's perspective. I know from more than an academic sense what the issues are. And so I happened to run into someone who knew her at a party and said, hey, are they hiring over there? I'd like to be able to help with these issues and bring the prosecutor perspective. And that person managed to get me in front of the president. And so to have risen to be the president's number 2, having not known her before and have her trust in me around these issues was actually very incredible. And I understand why people don't get that. So I didn't
must
come
have been
up.
quite a feeling to have been the day you got that call, huh?
It was equal parts exciting and then equal parts, nauseating.
Why did I open my big mouth?
To take on such a huge endeavor, was second largest county in the country. We have a $4 billion budget. But I didn't know her. She had faith in my credentials as a lawyer in the state's attorney's office, at the guardian's office, and the fact that I came up from the communities that we were talking about. So her support of my campaign is largely around, one, she had a chance for 2 years to watch me work, to watch me manage teams of people, teams of professionals, manage a very large budget, and to take on these issues of criminal justice reform hands-on, and we've done some really amazing things. So her support of me, I don't take lightly, because I think she's had the closest view of what my vision and values are, and so I'm pleased to have her support.
Now, of course, her support also has been financial. She's given you some money, and if we're to believe Dan Mihalopoulos' column yesterday in the Sun-Times, she put $25,000 into some pre-polling for you. And he's making the argument that this is a violation of election law, that you did not report the 25K, she didn't report 25K. Anything you want to clear up about that?
Yeah, what I'll say about that is, I believe the headline was that Kim Foxx is foggy on campaign laws. We have a lawyer that is assigned, that I've hired to work with us on these issues. I am a former prosecutor, a policymaker. I am not a campaign law expert, but I've hired campaign law experts to deal with that issue. And so it's one where we were working on. I think it's a more complicated or complex question in terms of how do you report when you're not yet a candidate, that we put our team to work on. And so they're working on it, and certainly if there's an issue that we need to resolve, it will be resolved. I absolutely believe we should be clear and transparent and accountable with campaign finance laws.
We got about 2 minutes, minute and a half left. So
wasn't
that fast? Yeah. So first of all, I'd love to have you come back at some point, and I'm sure we will as the campaign. We got another year of this, but
we've got 6 months. The
6
primary is April.
Primary. That's right. That's right.
We're not coming
exactly
back.
Right. I should be clear on that. So that's right.
March.
It's
15th.
March is the election we're talking about. Yeah. Quick round. Concealed carry. What do you think about concealed carry? Is it hurting or helping law enforcement?
It's the law of the land. I think Illinois was, the last to come on board. I think we have been spending the last couple of years trying to be thoughtful and strategic and making sure that we are keeping our citizens safe. I think the parameters that are in place right now are good, and we're continuing to build on them.
Obviously, there was that huge thing that happened this weekend with the guy who shot somebody and killed him in the grocery store, and the police decided not to press charges. Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine what that would mean for you if you were a prosecutor. Then there's nothing you do, right? It just drops. That's the end of that.
The prosecutor gets cases that are referred to them by the police department.
Only when they're referred by the police department. There are, like I said, just so many other things that I want to ask you about, but we're going to have to deal with those another time. Bond court is one. We could do a half hour just on the bond court issue, because that is a real mess. It's been described as medieval, and I'm sure you feel the same way. If you want to give me 20 seconds on that.
I think the president's office, and while I was there, we worked to take on bond court reform. We've come a long way in just 2 years from 2013, where we had less than 20% of the people who came through bond court were given alternative releases, to now 66%. And so there's much work to be done, but I think we've come a long way.
And we'll deal with that another time. Kim Foxx, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed having you. Thanks for coming. Kim Foxx is running for state's attorney of Cook County. And you've been watching Chicago Newsroom. It's a production of CAN TV. You can watch us anytime you want just by going to this address right here. And we'll be back next week with another show. Thank you so much for watching, and so long for now.